It starts on the page. That's the motto of the Writers Guild of America. But it's also a simple fact about how every American program you've ever seen originates. It starts with a writer facing a blank page and going through numerous hurdles to try to get that idea before an audience. While it's not uncommon for a producer or a studio to initiate the process of making a show, their first step in making it happen is hiring a writer who can bring it to reality. So where does the idea for that show come from? There are two traditional avenues. The first way is the easiest to understand. A writer simply has an idea and develops it from scratch. The other way is through what's commonly known as intellectual property, or IP. Simply put, the term intellectual property encompasses anything covered by copyright, trademark, or patent. It means that the premise that birthed the television show didn't originate with the writer who created the series. The idea can come from a variety of sources. For instance, comic books gave us The Walking Dead and novels gave us Game of Thrones. The Israeli show Prisoners of War gave us the Emmy-winning American series Homeland. But IP can also come from a variety of places, a video game or a podcast or an article in a magazine or newspaper. A few years ago, a studio even tried to develop Bazooka Joe as a movie. Do you guys know what Bazooka Joe is? It's a little piece of gum like the gorilla gum. They tried to make that into a movie. So IP can come from anything, even from a gum wrapper. More and more of late, Hollywood has been trending towards developing intellectual property into TV shows and movies. Although some would say it's to the detriment of the medium, I would remind those critics that TV has always relied on pre-existing properties. Lassie came from a book, and The Lone Ranger originated as a radio serial. In the case of shows that are born of IP, the most common scenario is for a producer or studio to option or buy the rights to the existing material and to hire a writer to turn it into a show. It's common for the producer who controls the IP to have what's known in the industry as a bake-off, which means that they invite several writers to vie for the opportunity to develop the property. Whichever writer presents the vision that the producers like the best wins the chance to turn it into a TV show. It's also possible for a writer to acquire a piece of IP on his or her own, or for the creator of the original IP to hook up with a screenwriter to spearhead the adaptation. The juggernaut that is Game of Thrones started because George Martin's agent, George Martin the novelist, his agent sent the novelist to screenwriter Dan Benioff in hopes that he would adapt it. But because of the slow-moving machine that is Hollywood, even though Benioff bit at the opportunity, it took over 5 years to turn that first meeting into a TV show. When a show originates with a screenwriter's original idea, the path to selling a show and to getting paid is more straightforward. When you have an original idea that you think might make a good show, you have two traditional options. You can pitch it to potential buyers, or you can write it on spec. Spec is short for speculatively. It means that you write the pilot script that will be the basis for your show in hopes that a network will buy it. And by the way, when I say network here, I include cable networks like HBO or streamers like Netflix under the banner of network. So you write the script completely on your own without attaching a producer or a studio, and it's a lot of work that may lead to nothing if you fail to sell it, but it can also be the best way of getting a clear vision across to a prospective buyer. A lot of writers write pilots on spec because even when the scripts don't sell, the new material serves as a potential writing sample that other potential employers can read. It's not impossible to get a spec on air. Mad Men and Desperate Housewives are famous examples of successful shows that started with a spec, but the more common route is to pitch your show. The vast majority of shows on your TV or your computer started out as a pitch. Whether you're a writer who had an original idea or a writer who was brought on to develop an existing piece of IP, chances are you're going to end up in a conference room about the size of this, trying to verbally sell your idea to a buyer. When you pitch a show, you have less than an hour to convince someone to give you a lot of money to buy your show. If you're a screenwriter who came up with a brilliant idea, it's crucial to come into this meeting with as many reasons as possible to make the buyer say yes. Sometimes you're the reason, if your name is Aaron Sorkin or Shonda Rhimes, but more often than not, you want to surround yourself with a team that makes your idea hard to reject, or with a variety of other supplemental materials. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to show you what we call a sizzle reel. And this is one for a show that I was pitching that we made up to try to convince the buyers to commit. So this is why this notion of putting all your cards on the table and trying to give a hard sell to the buyer is why most writers, whether they spec the script or crafted the idea into a pitch, will seek out a partnership with a producer. There are three kinds of producers in TV in the States. The most common is the writer-producer. That's what I am. A writer-producer is responsible for not only writing the scripts for the episodes that you're going to see, but also for overseeing several key aspects of production. I'll come back to the writer-producer in a little bit when I talk about the role of a showrunner. The second kind of producer is the line producer. The line producer is responsible for every aspect of physical production. They're the boss of everyone except for the writers. From casting to stunts to wardrobe, everyone except for the writer answers to the line producer. Their main job is to make sure that the scripts the writers deliver can be produced on budget and on time, and to make sure that all the departments deliver their work on budget and on time. The third kind of producer, and this is the one that you want to get on your side when you're pitching a show, is what's typically called as a non-writing EP, EP being short for executive producer. The non-writing EP typically has a production company that produces other shows. Sometimes these production companies are directly affiliated with a studio or a network. They have what's called a shingle inside the studio or the network. A good producer usually has a good relationship with the studio or the network, often because they prove themselves to be reliable providers of content by having other shows on the air. Sometimes producers will have access to directors or stars that can help make your show more appealing to a buyer. If you have a star or a director attached to your project when you make your pitch, and ideally if you can have these people present at your pitch meeting, the odds of selling your idea skyrocket. Even if you don't have a star or a director, having a producer with a proven track record at your side tells the people holding the checkbook that you're as reliable as these people that they know already and trust. This is the path, for instance, that the creators of Stranger Things followed. The Duffer Brothers, who are the creators of the show, were unknown writers who had had a little bit of experience but had a great idea. They wanted to do an homage to the classic horror and sci-fi movies of the 1980s. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. They had a clear vision for the show, but they didn't have enough clout for buyers to take them seriously. So they took out their idea with a spec pilot and a show Bible, and they took it to a number of different outlets, and all of them passed. Until the brothers met and attached producers Dan Cohen and Sean Levy, who hadn't done a lot of TV, but had produced the successful Night at the Museum movies. With these reputable producers on board, the show quickly sold to Netflix with a straight-to-series order. So what's the lesson here? For both writers and producers, the lesson is that the relationship between the two is symbiotic. It behooves writers to find producers they can trust with their material, and it benefits producers to seek out and nurture new voices that may not yet have the success they need to sell their own show. It's crucial for producers to understand and embrace what I said at the beginning of this presentation. It starts on the page. The more writers you know, the more you can help them hone their material into something spectacular. The more the writers you work with can trust you, the better for everyone involved. Keep in mind, in American television, the producer isn't spending any of his or her money. In feature films, the producer is often responsible for coming up with the financing for a film, but in television, that's the studio's job. The producer is there to put all the pieces together at the beginning of a production and to help ensure that everything runs smoothly once the show is on its feet. In American television, the head writer of a show is called the showrunner, and the showrunner is the boss of everyone, including the line producer. The showrunner answers only to their corporate bosses at the studio and the network. They make the final decisions on everything, from the first word on the script to the last cut in the edit bay. They're the keepers of the creative vision of the show. The job of the producer is to help the showrunner in a variety of different ways, which are individual to the relationship between the producer, the non-writing EP, and the showrunner. I've had showrunners who hate the politics of dealing with the studio and ask their non-writing EPs to act as a liaison between them. I've known producers who help by covering set when a writer isn't available to be there. I've also had producers who are never heard from again once they help sell the show. Needless to say, the job description is pretty flexible. Now back to pitching, which is a process. It's a process that has changed dramatically ever since streaming giants like Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu entered the playing field. 10 years ago, your best hope was to sell your show to NBC, CBS, ABC, or Fox. These guys had the most prestige, but more importantly, they had the most money to spend, which meant you could produce a more ambitious show and get richer while doing it. Yes, you could sell to other outlets like the Sci-Fi Channel or USA or TNT, but everybody wanted to be in business with the big boys. Of course, the big boys have now changed. Now everyone wants to be in business with Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu. Why? Some will make a case for creative freedom, but anybody who has worked with these new streaming networks will tell you that the creative process is nearly identical to working with the old networks. So why does everyone suddenly want to work with the streamers? As it so often does in Hollywood, the answer is money. As they launched over the last decade, these fledgling outlets needed to make a splash to compete with the old guard. In order to make a splash, they needed to make a product that was recognizably A-list. And the way you make A-list product is to spend money. House of Cards was Netflix's first ever TV show. It was produced and directed by visionary director David Fincher and starred Oscar-winning director Kevin Spacey. It also cost more than any other comparable network drama at the time. Since then, the budgets have only skyrocketed. Netflix and Amazon now produce shows that cost upwards of $10 million an episode to launch, when its most expensive rivals average about $4.5 million per episode. With these budgets, it's no wonder that writers, directors, and actors are flocking to the streaming outlets. They can make art at the highest standards, television that looks like big budget movies, television with no holds barred. So why not go there instead of to the old guard? But wait a minute, what does that have to do with pitching? Well, beyond higher budgets allowing creators to envision more ambitious stories, the streamers caused a quantum shift in the way television is written these days. And that affects everything from the inception of the idea to how it's developed into a series. Streamers want audiences to binge their shows, which means they want complicated, serialized storytelling that will keep the audience clicking to watch the next episode. A decade ago, you would have been crazy to pitch a serialized show. Now it's a must. More and more, when writers pitch their series to a network, especially a cable network or a streaming outlet, they're not pitching the pilot and the kinds of episodes that will stem from it. They're pitching a fully conceived story. Sometimes that story is a season long, sometimes it's several seasons long. In fact, when Vince Gilligan pitched Breaking Bad to AMC, he described a 5-season arc for Walter White that would see him devolve from a kind-hearted teacher like Mr. Chips in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, to a cold-hearted kingpin like Scarface. The point being that the tried-and-true cop, lawyer, doctor franchises that saw the protagonists solving a standalone case every week is no longer the golden egg. Serialized storytelling is where it's at. Which brings us back to the topic of IP. Shows like Game of Thrones or Walking Dead have had sprawling stories in their original media that a buyer can look at and understand exactly where the show might go beyond the first season. You can read the comic, you can read the novels, you can see how the story is going to sustain for years on end. This provides a level of creative security that an original idea simply can't. Beyond that, even a modest IP can provide a network with enough name recognition to help with the show's promotability. Why would Netflix greenlight an original superhero show when they can make Jessica Jones? Why would the CW make an original Latin drama when it can acquire the rights to a popular Mexican soap and turn it into Jane the Virgin? These original IPs may not have meant much to the average viewer before they were developed, but they meant something to somebody. And networks are banking on that little bit of curiosity to drive people to their programming when they make their creative decisions. The writer that walks in the door without even the most modest piece of IP has an uphill climb. Which takes us all the way back to the writer who showed up at the network's door trying to sell his idea. Let's say he sold it. Congratulations. What happens next? The network tends to buy a pilot script first, which means that after months of hard work, our writer is finally getting paid, which means it's time to talk deal. In the States, when you sell a show, you're typically dealing with two corporate entities, a network and a studio. The studio owns the show, flat out. They hold all the rights that are not specifically negotiated by the studio. You know the names of the big studios: Universal, 20th Century Fox, Disney, etc. They pay the show creators a salary to make the show and typically allow them to retain about 12% of the show itself. An attached producer will also receive a small percentage, as will an actor or a director who's involved at this stage. The studio pays out the money to make the show. The cost of actually producing the show and putting it on the air is up to them to produce. Say the $4 million an episode it costs to physically produce a show on the big four networks. The studio takes the biggest financial risk up front and reaps the biggest financial benefits if the show is successful, and they can then sell it into syndication or into the various foreign markets. The network risks less and therefore benefits less. To put the show on their air, the network pays what's called a license fee, which is a fraction of the show's actual budget. They then make their money by selling commercials that air during that show. But the advent of the streaming outlets has started a shift in this traditional paradigm. For the last few decades, networks have often had corporate partners, studios that produce the content that they aired. ABC had Disney, NBC had Universal, Fox had 20th Century Fox, etc. But Netflix and Amazon have no corporate overlords, and they've decided to combine the roles of the studio and the network under one roof. When you pitch to Netflix or Amazon, it's now something of a liability to have a studio attached. These new players want to be the studio and the network themselves. They don't want someone else taking the big risk and reaping the big reward. They want to produce the show themselves and air it on their platform. Which begs the question, how do these companies have so much money at their disposal to begin with? That's another way in which the streamers are changing the paradigm. Instead of taking the big chances up front and hoping to sell their show once it's successful into syndication or internationally, as the studios have been doing for decades, the streamers are pre-selling their titles abroad before they even roll cameras, allowing them to spend freely with minimum risk. But there's always some risk inherent in making a TV show, and networks have to pick and choose which ones they think have the best chance of being successful. Otherwise, every writer who walks into a network with an idea would get a TV show made. The old wisdom told us that there were only so many hours a network could program, and this was true until streaming came about. The average network had fewer than 20 hours of airtime a week before their slate was filled to capacity. But streamers don't program by the hour. Netflix recently announced that they will release around 700 new series and movies this year, including 80 original productions from outside the United States. So wait, with that number of shows, does it mean that every writer and producer can get a show on the air? No. In fact, let's check back with the writer who was lucky enough to sell his series pitch. Once his deal is closed, the writer will go off to write an outline for the pilot script. The producer, studio, and network will ask for changes to the outline until they're satisfied that it's in good enough shape to become a script. Then the writer will spend 2 to 3 weeks writing the script, which will again undergo revisions suggested by the producers in the studio before going to the network for its day in court, before they decide whether they want to shoot the pilot episode. This is the next big hurdle for the writer. Compared to shooting a full pilot episode, scripts are cheap, so networks buy far more scripts than they intend to make. Even if you're lucky enough to sell your script in the first place, you only have about a 10 to 15% chance of seeing that script shot. If you're one of the lucky ones and you get your script greenlit, you get to film your script. You get to hire a director, you get to cast your actors, you get to find your locations, and make the show you saw in your head. For a writer-producer, there's nothing more gratifying, but you're not at the finish line yet. Like they do at the script stage, networks shoot far more pilots than they will order a series. Once you deliver your final product, The network then retreats into private meetings to decide whether they think your pilot is good enough to merit putting it on the air and ordering more episodes. This process can last weeks, as the various strata of executives watch and chime in with their opinions. The final pilot is also screened for test audiences around the country, which means ordinary TV consumers get to tell your prospective bosses whether they love or hate your show. These test audiences can be vicious. I once actually had a member of a test audience criticize the wallpaper in a scene. But here's another way in which streamers are changing the game. We talked about the serialized nature of programmers like Netflix and Amazon. We covered how show creators must now present a fully realized vision of a first season and beyond in order to sell their series. Well, here at the series order stage is where that can pay off. A lot of streamers don't believe in the old math. They believe that shooting a dozen expensive pilots and ordering only 1 or 2 to series is wasteful. So they're more deliberate in which scripts they choose to sink their money into, and often bypass shooting the pilot and order the show straight to series based on the pilot script. This new philosophy can create a virtuous circle. An A-list actor is less likely to sign up for a pilot that may never see the light of day, but guarantee that his show will air, and the odds jump exponentially. Therefore, the network's commitment to a series order helps them attach a significant talent, which in turn raises the marquee value of their new series. But ultimately, even a show that's lucky enough to make it to air faces one final hurdle: the audience. For every Stranger Things and House of Cards, there are dozens of series that show up on your TV or computer and disappear in the blink of an eye. The creators of those shows aren't less talented than the others, nor did they work less hard, but audiences are ultimately fickle and unpredictable, and no revolutionary streaming service or 21st century metrics can save some shows from cancellation. But there's one benefit we all reap from these streaming upstarts that has nothing to do with bottom lines, ratings, and popularity. As I mentioned, Netflix is partnering with dozens of countries across the world to create new content. Their brand extends to over 190 countries. Their newest show, Altered Carbon, features a cast from all around the globe. Because Netflix and Amazon aren't exclusively targeting American audiences, these streamers are looking for content that has worldwide appeal. That means they want stories that have unique international voices, actors that look different than the traditional matinee idols, and places that represent the vast variety of cultures on the planet. They know that they can make money by making their shows look more like the world around them. But I think making TV shows look more like the world around us can help bring the world together and make us realize that we are more alike than we think. And I believe that if we can show the world how to coexist on our screens, we may just show them how to coexist in the real world. Thank you. So now I'm going to show you something that you'll hopefully think is fun. This is the sizzle reel that I promised you. So my friend and I were approached by the head of Sony Studio to develop a role-playing game for them. And so it's a role-playing game kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And it's just the rules for the game. And so we were tasked with creating a show around that. And that's what we did. But we had these 2 massive books with a lot of illustrations, a lot of art. And so we decided one thing we could do to help us show the tone and the vibe of the show to our prospective buyers, because it's a weird world and it's a weird universe that we're trying to sell, was to make this 2.5-minute sizzle reel that would essentially give them an idea of what a commercial for the show might look like. So here it is.
I was just like you once. I had a good job, a husband I adored. We were about to have a daughter. Then the men came to tell me about the end of the world. I had skills they needed, so I made a deal to save my family. We were supposed to wake up shortly after the asteroids hit. Me, my family, my team. We had a plan to restart our way of life. But our plan failed. I woke up centuries too late. Cities had fallen. Ice caps had melted. A plague had swept across the planet. Civilization as we knew it crumbled. The survivors descended into a hell of sex and violence. The world I knew wasn't just gone, it had turned into a nightmare. Doctors became warriors. Armies became cults. Nations became barbaric clans. Life became war. But the plague from the asteroid spawned something beyond mere illness, a terrifying mutation that threatened all life. They called it homodegenesis. My daughter is out there in this nightmare, frozen in a cryogenic sleep across the continent. To find her, I will have to trust 4 strangers from this terrifying future. But I will find her, and we will build a life together, even if I have to go through hell to do it.
So this is just one example of the kinds of material that you can bring with you to a pitch to try to make it easy for them to buy it. These guys listen to dozens of pitches a week, and their first reaction is always to say no. So if you can bring an actor, a director, a producer, something like this that makes them want to eat popcorn and give you money, do it. Thank you.